If you're a mid-sized country in 2026, there's a brutal rule: either you have a seat at the table, or you're on the menu. At Davos, Canada's Prime Minister said it plainly: when you don't get a chair, you don't get a vote, you get handed the decision after it's made. Because Canada's problem isn't just that it lost a seat. Canada spent decades building a life around one assumption: that the neighbor who buys your goods and guards your continent will keep playing by the old rules. Then the rules changed. Overnight, special relationship became leverage. Tariffs weren't a policy debate, they were a pressure valve, cranked shut. Markets flinched, supply chains snapped, jobs vanished. And suddenly a line that sounded like a joke, the 51st state, didn't feel funny anymore. And the pressure didn't just come from outside. Inside Canada, housing was boiling, trust in government was thin. And the country had quietly sold off its last real insurance, its gold, right before the storm. This isn't a moral story about heroes and villains. It's a story about power, leverage, and what happens when you bet your whole future on a single customer, then wake up to find you've put yourself on the menu. For more than a century, Canada and the United States were held up as the cleanest partnership on Earth. The world's longest unarmed border. Two economies stitched together so tightly that trade flowed like blood through a single artery, roughly $2.5 billion in goods crossing every day. People didn't just call it cooperation. They called it a special relationship. And for a long time, that story felt true. Free trade deals in the late 20th century supercharged growth. Businesses expanded. Jobs multiplied. Supply chains became so integrated that a single car could cross the border multiple times before it was finished. The logic seemed airtight: if Canada and the U.S. were this intertwined, neither side would ever choose to hurt the other, because it would be like punching your own face. That belief became Canada's comfort blanket. The deeper the integration, the safer it must be. The more dependent we are, the less likely they are to pull the plug. But that's the illusion, confusing connection with protection. Because interdependence only works as a shield when both players still believe in the same game. The moment one side decides pain is acceptable, maybe even useful, interdependence flips. What used to feel like stability becomes a handle someone can grab. And Canada, without realizing it, had built its national strategy around a single, dangerous idea: that trust was permanent. Here's the number that turns Canada's story from close partners into single point of failure: 76%. By 2024, Canada was sending about 3/4 of its exports to the United States. That isn't just trade. That's dependency at the level of survival. In business terms, Canada had one customer, one buyer so large that losing them doesn't mean lower profits. It means the company might not make payroll. And Canada didn't stumble into this by accident. For decades, leaders treated deeper integration as the safest path: more pipelines, more cross-border manufacturing, more shared standards. More just-in-time supply chains. The bet was simple: the closer we are, the harder it is for either side to weaponize the relationship. But the bet had a hidden flaw: it assumed the U.S. would always calculate costs the way Canada did. Because when 76% of your exports go through one gate, you don't really have trade policy anymore. You have gate management. Your bargaining position shrinks to one question: how do we keep the gate open? And that's not negotiation, that's fear. The danger isn't only that tariffs can hit you. It's that everything becomes vulnerable at once: autos, agriculture, manufacturing, energy, logistics. Border towns whose entire economy depends on trucks moving smoothly. Even a small disruption ripples like an earthquake because the system has no alternative route. Canada saw the risk. It just kept betting anyway. Because as long as the gate stayed open, prosperity felt normal. Until the day the gatekeeper decided to remind everyone who holds the keys. Even before the external pressure hit, Canada was already under strain, and the biggest crack was housing. Think about the irony: the second largest country on Earth, nearly 10 million square kilometers. Yet only around 40 million people, fewer than California. And still, Canada slid into one of the worst housing crises in the developed world. In cities like Toronto and Vancouver, average home prices pushed past $1 million. For a huge share of young Canadians, homeownership stopped being a dream and became a punchline. Even renting, just finding a stable place to live, started feeling like a monthly emergency. And here's the part that makes it politically toxic: even official forecasts admitted the system couldn't catch up. Double the construction pace, they said, and the shortage still wouldn't be solved. Under current trends, Toronto's prices could keep climbing into the next decade. Translation: the pressure wasn't temporary. It was structural. That's when the housing market turns into a political pressure cooker. Every election becomes a bidding war of promises: we'll build. We'll lower prices. We'll fix affordability. New faces repeat the same lines because they work, until they don't. Because fixing housing for real means taking on powerful interests, developers, investors, zoning politics. And the uncomfortable math of population growth outpacing supply. Immigration becomes part of that tension, not as a moral argument, but as a numbers problem. When hundreds of thousands of people enter the market each year and construction can't keep up, prices don't negotiate. They explode. Politicians know that touching this issue risks angering donors, homeowners, and entire local economies built on rising property values. So the loop continues: big promises, small changes, zero relief. And when everyday life starts to feel unlivable, national unity gets fragile, because people stop believing the system can protect them. That's the kind of weakness the outside world can smell from a mile away. Housing was the slow burn. But what turned frustration into cynicism was something deeper: the feeling that the system could waste billions, fail publicly. And nobody would ever pay a price. Canada's political class kept selling the same product: grand announcements, glossy press conferences. Historic investments, while everyday results got worse. The pattern became familiar: launch a massive project, promise thousands of jobs. Call it a national transformation, then watch it collapse into delays, cost overruns, or straight-up failure. Take the green industry dream. One province poured public money into an electric battery factory deal that was supposed to prove Canada could lead the clean economy. Politicians posed for photos. Headlines celebrated the future. Then the parent company went bankrupt. The factory never arrived. The jobs never appeared. The money was gone, and the story ended with shrugs instead of consequences. Or look at government tech modernization. In theory, digitizing licensing and insurance should be boring and fast. In practice, it became a money pit: budgets ballooned, timelines slipped, the system launched unstable. And citizens were left dealing with outages and chaos. Audits pointed to flawed procurement and unfair advantages built into the process from day one. Still, no one went to jail, no one got fired, and no serious accountability landed. That's how trust erodes. Not through one scandal, but through repetition. Because when voters see a cycle of big promises, disastrous execution, zero consequences, they stop believing the state can solve hard problems. And when a country can't govern itself effectively, it loses the most important asset in a crisis: credibility. By the time external pressure arrived, Canada wasn't standing on solid ground. It was standing on fatigue, anger, and a growing suspicion that the people in charge were never going to fix the machine. Canada didn't just bet on one customer. It also sold the one thing you don't sell right before a storm: insurance. In 2015 and 2016, Canada quietly unloaded almost all of its gold reserves until the national stockpile was basically symbolic, about 917 ounces ** left. The country made roughly $122 million from the sale, and the logic sounded modern, even sensible: gold doesn't pay interest. It costs money to store, and real reserves are supposed to be liquid, things like major currencies and U.S. treasuries. But that logic mistakes accounting for survival. Gold isn't a growth asset. It's not meant to perform. Gold is what you hold when the world stops performing. It's what sits outside politics, outside promises, outside someone else's central bank. It's leverage you don't have to ask permission to use. Canada once held around 1,003 tons back in the 1960s, real weight, real insurance. And in this story's timeline, as gold prices surged over the years, that decision started to look less like optimization and more like self-disarmament. Because while Canada was modernizing its reserves, other countries were quietly doing the opposite, stacking gold not for profit, but for power. So when trade pressure hit and the Canadian dollar weakened, Canada had no hard ballast, no asset that could hold value independent of politics. Even worse, much of the country's reserves were parked in paper, including U.S. dollars. It's a brutal irony, trying to protect yourself from American pressure by holding the American currency. That's not a shield. That's a confession, one that says, if you squeeze us, we don't have another hand to play. While Canada was selling its last fire extinguisher, the rest of the world was quietly stacking them in the basement. Because the countries that live closest to geopolitical weather, sanctions, currency swings, trade wars, learned a simple lesson. When the rules change overnight, paper promises can evaporate. Gold doesn't. China kept adding to its reserves. Russia accumulated hard assets before the door slammed shut. India, Turkey, Poland, and a long list of emerging economies kept buying, often without fanfare, often without headlines. Not because they were nostalgic, but because they understood what gold really is, a tool of independence. Gold isn't there to make you richer on a spreadsheet. It's there to keep you alive when access gets cut off, when payments freeze, when currencies get punished. When foreign reserves become a political weapon. In a crisis, gold can be sold, swapped, pledged, or simply held as proof that you still have something real when confidence collapses. That's why this matters. In the era Canada thought was ending, great power competition, financial coercion, economic warfare, gold becomes leverage. It becomes options. And that's the point, other countries were buying options. Canada was giving them away for pocket change. Then the switch flipped. In November 2024, Donald Trump won the election, and before he even took office, the tone changed from diplomacy to dominance. This wasn't the usual, a few % tariff threat that gets negotiated down behind closed doors. This was a message, 25% on Canada and Mexico. A blunt instrument aimed at the heart of a supply chain that had taken generations to build. Publicly, the justification was border security, fentanyl, illegal crossings, the kind of headlines that play well on cable news. With Mexico, that argument had an obvious political target. With Canada, it worked like a legal pretext, something you could point to while doing what you wanted to do anyway. Because Trump's real complaint wasn't subtle. He believed Canada benefited too much. He saw trade deals as losses, not partnerships. And he had never been shy about turning allies into opponents if it helped him win leverage. Late November, Canada's Prime Minister flew to Mar-a-Lago to calm things down, to restore the old relationship, to reset the temperature. But the meeting didn't reset anything. It became the start of a humiliation campaign. Trump began calling him governor, like Canada wasn't a sovereign country but a subordinate territory. Then came the line that sounded like a troll post, Canada as the 51st state. At first, people laughed. They treated it like classic Trump theater, an insult, a headline, a distraction. But this time the joke came with a timer. On May 1, 2025, Trump declared a national emergency and put the tariffs into motion, 25% on most Canadian goods. With energy hit differently but still punished. And that's when Canadians realized something that's easy to miss until you feel it in your paycheck: tariffs aren't just taxes. They're a weapon. A weapon that doesn't need tanks. A weapon that doesn't fire bullets. A weapon that turns the border, once a symbol of peace, into a choke point. And when your country sends 3/4 of its exports through that choke point, the person holding the lever doesn't need to negotiate. They can simply pull. The impact hit fast, because systems this integrated don't adjust. They break. Canadian markets dropped. The loonie weakened. Companies that had operated for decades suddenly faced a brutal math problem: the cost of selling into their only real market just jumped overnight. A tariff like that doesn't politely reduce margins, it forces decisions. Cancel orders. Cut shifts. Lay off workers. Move production. Shut down. And the supply chains that once felt like a miracle of efficiency turned into a trap. Cross-border manufacturing depends on smooth timing. Parts cross the line, get assembled, cross again, get refined, cross again, until the final product is complete. Add friction, and the whole machine starts grinding. Trucks stack up. Contracts get rewritten. Investment plans get frozen because no CEO wants to pour money into a country whose access to its main customer is now political. Canada hit back with retaliatory tariffs, first tens of billions in U.S. goods, then more. But retaliation only works when the pain is symmetrical. Here, it wasn't. Canada needed the U.S. market far more than the U.S. needed Canada. That 76% number stopped being a statistic and became a noose. Jobs disappeared in the places you'd expect, manufacturing towns, logistics hubs, border communities built on the daily flow of trade. Uncertainty spread like a virus. Even businesses that weren't directly targeted pulled back because confidence is an ecosystem. When the mood shifts, everyone gets cautious. Unemployment climbed. Investment stalled. Growth turned negative. But the deeper damage was psychological, the realization that prosperity had been built on access, and access could be revoked. That's the moment a country stops arguing about policy and starts arguing about survival. And in survival mode, unity is the first thing that gets tested, because people don't just ask, how do we fix this? They ask, who's responsible, and why are we so exposed? And right when Canada needed a captain in a storm, it got something worse than a bad decision, a vacuum. As the tariffs loomed and the economy started to buckle, the Prime Minister announced he would step down. Not immediately, later, after the party chose a replacement. In practical terms, that meant Canada entered its most serious economic shock in decades with a leader who was already half out the door. Negotiating with a U.S. president who openly treated him like a placeholder. In politics, perception is power. On a normal day, a lame duck leader is a weakness. In a crisis, it's an invitation. Trump didn't just see Canada's dependence, he saw the moment Canada was least able to respond with unity, speed, or credibility. Every meeting became tilted before it started. Every threat landed harder because Ottawa looked divided, uncertain, and slow. And here's the cruel part, crises don't pause for election calendars. Supply chains don't wait for party votes. Investors don't hold off until the new leader settles in. The window where early decisions matter most, where you can stabilize confidence and set a direction, was exactly when Canada was stuck in political limbo. A country can survive pressure. What it can't survive is pressure plus drift. Because when leadership hesitates, something else rushes in to fill the space: panic, anger, regional resentment. And once that starts, the fight stops being Canada versus tariffs. It becomes Canada versus itself. Under economic stress, Canada didn't just wobble, it started to pull apart at the seams. Because Canada has always been more complicated than the postcard version. It's a federation of provinces with different economies, different cultures, and very different relationships with the United States. When times are good, those differences fade into the background. When times are bad, they become fault lines. Start with Alberta. Alberta is oil country, entrepreneurial, conservative, and culturally closer, in many ways, to Montana or Texas than to Toronto or Montreal. For years, many Albertans felt Ottawa treated them like a wallet: take the revenue, send it east. And then lecture them about environmental rules that hit their core industry. Add the tariff shock, and the bitterness spikes. The province's biggest export market turns hostile, and the federal government looks powerless to defend it. That's when old ideas come roaring back: petitions, talk of referendums, even whispers of leaving Canada entirely. And then there's Quebec. Quebec has lived with the sovereignty question for decades. It has language, identity, and a long memory of being different. It already held referendums in 1980 and 1995, the second one nearly split the country, decided by less than a single percentage point. For years the debate cooled, mostly because the economic case for staying in Canada felt safer. But in this crisis, safe starts to sound like a lie. If Ottawa can't protect the economy, if the U.S. relationship is poisoned either way, if the Federation feels like instability instead of security, then Quebec's question returns. Asterisk, what are we actually gaining by staying? Asterisk, and once that question becomes mainstream, it stops being theoretical. It becomes electoral. Here's the nightmare scenario: one province breaks, and the rest start calculating. If Alberta leaves, maybe Saskatchewan follows. If Quebec leaves, Canada gets split geographically, and the Atlantic provinces become isolated. British Columbia weighs its own interests. Ontario bleeds investment. Suddenly the country isn't debating policy, it's debating whether the Federation still makes sense. That's what leverage can do. It doesn't have to conquer you. It just has to push hard enough that you fracture yourself. So Canada finally said the thing it should have said years earlier: we need more doors. After the tariff shock, Ottawa announced a new strategy: double exports to non-US markets over the next decade. Diversify. Build alternatives. Stop living off a single customer. On paper, it was obvious. In reality, it was a trap. Because the moment Canada tried to open a second door, Washington reminded everyone who controls the hallway. Canada took a step toward China, not a full free trade pact, but a targeted deal meant to unblock stalled exports and create breathing room. Chinese tariffs on key Canadian agricultural products would drop. Canadian producers would get access, orders would return, jobs would stabilize. It was the kind of pragmatic move a country makes when it's choking. And then Trump exploded. To Washington, Canada wasn't diversifying. Canada was becoming a backdoor, an entry point for China into the U.S. market. Whether that fear was fair or exaggerated didn't matter. What mattered was the leverage, the ability to punish instantly. The threat came like a sledgehammer, a 100% tariff if Canada kept moving down that path. That's not negotiation. That's a veto. So Canada backed down, publicly clarifying it wasn't pursuing broader trade ties with China. Not because it wanted to. Because it couldn't. A 100% tariff would be economic arson. And when your economy is built around one gate, you don't get to test how flammable the house really is. This is the brutal geometry of dependence. The stronger party doesn't just demand better terms. It decides what choices the weaker party is allowed to have at all. Canada was trying to escape the cage. The response was simple: no. You belong here. And that's when the crisis stopped being about tariffs and started being about sovereignty in the real sense: what a country can do, who it can trade with, and whether it's free to choose its own way out. So where does that leave Canada? Not defeated in a war. Not occupied. Not conquered. But something arguably worse for a modern nation: constrained, boxed in by its own design. Canada didn't lose because it lacked talent or resources. It lost leverage because it traded leverage away, piece by piece, for convenience. It built an economy around one customer. It treated deep integration as protection. It let domestic pressure, housing, governance failures, broken trust, erode its internal strength. And it sold off a form of insurance that other countries still treat as emergency power. Then the world changed. When the U.S. decided to use economic pressure as a weapon, Canada discovered the difference between friendship and dependency. In geopolitics, fair is not a strategy. Morality doesn't enforce contracts. Power does. Leverage does. Options do. That's the universal lesson here, and it doesn't belong only to Canada. A nation is like a business. If one client pays your bills, that client eventually sets your rules. If one partner guarantees your security, that partner eventually writes your limits. The goal isn't isolation. The goal is redundancy: multiple markets, multiple alliances, multiple ways to breathe when one line gets cut. And leadership matters most when the room is on fire. In a crisis, hesitation is a luxury you don't have. A vacuum gets filled by chaos, by resentment, by separatism, by the slow death of national trust. Canada's story isn't finished. There's still a path where the country rebuilds, diversifies trade, restores confidence, repairs unity, earns back the belief that the Federation is worth keeping. But the clock is real. because the longer pressure lasts, the louder the fracture gets. So remember the rule from the beginning: in 2026, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. The only way off the menu is leverage, earned, protected, and never surrendered just because the old world felt comfortable. If you made it this far, you already understand the real story isn't just Canada, it's the price of dependence in a world that's turning hard again. So here's my question for you: if your country, or your business, had one customer, one protector, one single point of failure, would you even know it until the gate slammed shut? Drop your take in the comments. Is Canada's crisis a warning, or just the first chapter of a new era of economic coercion? If you want more deep-dive storytelling like this, where geopolitics meets real-world incentives, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. This is Global Lens, and I'll see you in the next one.